Hi, I'm John Hibbins, and this is the Metaverse Show. You can find us on Roomkey, YouTube, and your favourite podcast provider. This is episode 5. And today I'm joined by our special guest, Kent Bye from the Voices of VR podcast. Since May 2014, Kent Bye has conducted over 1,600 Voices of VR podcast interviews featuring pioneer artists, storytellers, and technologists driving the resurgence of virtual and augmented reality. He's an oral historian, experiential journalist, and an aspiring philosopher, helping to define patterns of immersive storytelling, experiential design, ethical frameworks, and the ultimate potential of XR. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
So I've just said 1,600 interviews, and I think they've distilled themselves into you're just about to do your 1,000th episode of Voices of VR podcast.
Yeah.
And I had a bit of a sneak peek because she sent me it. It's quite a long one, 3 hours. I had to sort of speed it up even from where you'd sped it up for me to get through it in time for the show. But what a great episode. Do you want to talk a little bit about that episode?
Yeah, so I started doing, well, I first got my virtual reality headset back in January 1st, 2014. And it was from there that I decided that this was like a really compelling medium, and I wanted to help, I guess, just kind of track the evolution of it. And so I went to the very first gathering, the virtual reality. It was a Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference gathering in May of 2014. I ended up doing about 45 interviews at that first gathering over those 2 days. And before there, I had published like 4 different interviews. But I really kickstarted at SVR in 2014 in May. It just felt like all this excitement around what was going to happen with this medium and what you could do with it. And so and I published all those different interviews, and it was a really good reaction. And then so since then, I've gone to over different 70 or 80 different gatherings over the last 70 years or 7 years, and recorded 1,600 interviews, and have published about 2/3 of what I've been able to record so far. So I'm coming up on episode number 1,000. And I wanted to do a little bit of a retrospective to be able to not only map out the contexts of all the different potentials for how people are using XR, but kind of my statement in terms of why I think this is not just a passing fad, that this is actually a really compelling new communications medium that is going to take root into a whole wide variety of different domains of human experience. And so after talking to so many people over the last 7 years, I wanted to do a little bit of a reflection of what the community has been talking about VR, why it gets so many people excited, both the potentials, but also some of the risks and some of the harms that we need to be aware of, because it's with any great new potential, there's a lot of ways in which that potential could be used for abuse and harm. So that's been a big part of my coverage as well. And I wanted to also include that a little bit of some of those different more, not unbridled optimism, but also some, cautious skepticism in terms of how far this is go, or what we really need to figure out in terms of in order to live into this ultimate potential of what this medium means that as humans we also have to grow, and we also have to come up with new frameworks and new ways of kind of organizing ourselves as a society, and what's that mean as we move forward. So yeah, I think for me, I just wanted to create like it was a 3-hour episode, sort of a retrospective and a bit of a celebration, just to kind of, mark the work that I've been doing over the last 7 years.
Yeah, well, I do want to talk to you about the episode and some of the things you touched on the episode. I also like to talk a little bit about, well, risks and harms of VR that you've just mentioned. Before I do, can I just dig into a couple of little details there? You purchased the DK1, did you? Were you a Kickstarter for the DK1?
No, so I wasn't a Kickstarter. I got it on January 1st, 2014. So at that point, they were just selling the DK1s.
Uh-huh.
So that was, I guess they got released in like March of 2013. So I was, the 9 months after they had launched. And at
How
that
did you
point,
become aware of how did you become aware of it? How did you first see the headset and decide, oh, I'm going to buy one of these?
well, the best that I could recollect for the first time that I heard of it was probably I was working at the time doing some data visualizations using 3JS. And and in the web there was a filter for Oculus, and it was like a double barrel, thing. Then I was like, oh wow, what's this? And I think I probably heard about it from there, or maybe I heard about it when the Kickstarter came out. And but it wasn't really on my radar. But I was trying to at the time find one way to do kind of a responsive web design application where I could write the code once and have it across many different applications. And I saw that Unity would be able to publish to all these different types of platforms. And so it was there. I was like, oh, well, maybe if I make this application within VR, then I could sort of downgrade it into all these other 2D versions of that. And so that's how it kind of started. But I remember watching Cymatic Bruce. He had done kind of the top 20 VR applications from the first year of consumer VR. So it was from 2013, and it was probably sometime in December. It was a new video, and the top 10 were based upon what people from the Oculus Reddit were saying what their favorite VR experiences were, and his top 10 were other experiences. But there was one the whole there was the one where you go around in the planets. It was Titans of Space. And that was one of the top 10 experiences. And I was like, oh, wow, there's stuff that's happening in VR that is just beyond what gaming was happening in the gaming world. Because, I was born in 1976, and I stopped playing video games in 1994 when I was like a sophomore in college. And it was just like, after my freshman year in college from 94 to 95. So it was really 20 years of not playing any video games from 1994 to 2014. So I wasn't really a gamer. I didn't really identify as a gamer, but I saw that there was an educational application. And then from there, I was like, oh, wow, there's actually some things that are interesting that are going on. Maybe I'll be into. And when I tried it out, I was just really blown away. And so I don't know if you remember the early days of VR where people were like checking our Oculus every day to see what the latest news was, and you never knew what kind of mind-blowing piece of information was going to come out, because it was such a new time period where people were really experimenting and pushing the limits of what's possible. So I think when I remember that time between January to May of 2014, Oculus got bought in that March of 2014. And so there was a lot of anticipation as to what was going to be the first, big gathering, professional gathering. And when SVR was announced, and this was ahead of when Oculus announced that they were going to have their own developer conference, I immediately was just like an instant buy. I was like, I'm there. I want to be there. I want to be a part of what is happening in this community. And I'd actually signed up for a 60-second pitch. I didn't really know what I was going to pitch. And so, or at least I had an idea of a sort of a project, but it was more of an idea than a project. And so then eventually I was like, you know what, I should do a podcast. Because at that point I had, done hundreds of podcasts in the Drupal community and other more esoteric communities, where I would go to conferences and I would do interviews with people. And it'd be a way that I would be able to learn about an area. And I was very interested in VR design, and there wasn't a lot of information about how you would even make a VR experience or what are the best practices. And so I always kind of looked at it from the perspective of a potential eventual VR maker, what type of stuff that I would want to make and what type of information we would need to know. But over the last 7 years, I've been really sort of caught up in this process of just documenting the community. And I think as I've been reflecting on episode 1000, I've also kind of gotten back into my roots of starting to make different VR experiences and kind of play around with other things that other people haven't done yet. Oh, I don't know if you're muted or not, but I can't hear you. I'm still not.
It's okay. I'm back.
Okay.
My mic unplugged itself. There you go. That's beauty of technology. Nothing to do with software. Just a wire. Anyway, sorry about that. So I'm really curious. What was your job then? Were you a statistical analyst? You made it sound like you were a statistical analyst doing that using VR to show analyzing. What was your job before? And do you still have a full-time job now? Is this something you're doing part-time or full-time?
I do the Voices of VR full-time and in part supported by Patreon, and then I do different talks and get speaking fees. But at the time, I was working at Puppet Labs as an IT automation company. And my background, I guess I have a degree in electrical engineering, and I spent some time in the military industrial complex working on an F-22 Raptor as a radar systems engineer. And then from there, worked into sort of Drupal open source software, doing like technical training videos. And so I guess, my background in engineering and science, I also have, kind of would make videos within high school. So I always had this kind of blending between art and science as my background. And so I was doing technical training videos for IT automation software for a startup called Puppet Labs when I first got into VR. That was in 2014. I'm not hearing you.
Hello? Right, I'm
Yeah,
giving up
there you
on
go. I
that.
can hear you now.
I've unplugged the other microphone. I'm going to have to give up on it. I won't sound as good on this one, but that's okay. So that gave you a really good foundation into the understanding of immersive education and how to use VR really well in terms of immersive content and training.
Yeah, because I would, have a degree in electrical engineering, I think that a big part of that training was being able to sort of hold different abstractions in your mind and um, go with a little bit of what you know and then be able to extrapolate. And being in the Drupal open source community and then in IT automation, where it was a very technical field, but being able to kind of translate some of these technical concepts into, just natural language, speaking about it, finding the right metaphors to really understand it. So, yeah, for me, I think the VR is very interesting because it actually allows me to kind of use all those technical groundings that I have in my background, but also start to pull in all those other more aspects of storytelling or art, and being able to kind of build and release tension in different ways. So yeah, a big thing that I've been loved to really cover over the last 7 years has been going to the film festivals like Sundance and South by Southwest and the Venice Film Festival and IFA Doc Lab and Tribeca Film Festival, and to see the frontiers of immersive storytelling, to see how artists have been really pushing the limits of how you tell stories, how you communicate different ideas using the spatial medium of VR.
And I mean, for those that haven't had the pleasure of meeting you in real life, typically I spot you in a corridor, sometimes serendipitously speaking to an amazing person that you've bumped into, always having a mic in your hand, battery pack on your on your belt. Is it organic, or do you sort of look ahead and say these are the people I really want to hunt out and get interviews from, or do you just hang out and then say, do you mind if we record this? How's your approach to doing a thousand podcasts? I mean, it's like enormous. Well, 1,600 people interviewing. You've
Yeah.
got enormous knowledge there of how to get somebody to start speaking. How do you do that? What's your typical approach?
Well, so I would, I guess, in some ways, go into a conference with my microphone and set an intention to be able to connect to other people who want to share information with me. And a lot of it was based upon the not really planning much ahead, but building enough of an awareness of people know who I am. And I know other people within the community as well, as I just sort of would track what's happening in the community through Twitter or, through the different news websites. So having a general awareness of what's happening. And then when I would go to an event and a gathering, just kind of roam the hallways and bump into people. And I would almost like create a second conference experience for myself where I would be getting information from a lot of the people who would end up, giving presentations and talks. But I'm not the type of learner to just like sit into a lecture and learn a lot. I love to be able to engage and ask questions. And so I would, in a lot of ways, try to take the speakers that were speaking and then be able to have like a one-on-one conversation with them. And sometimes I would schedule and pre-plan stuff but for the most part, a lot of and before the pandemic, of course. So from 2014 to 2019, the last conference I went to was in 2020 at Sundance in January. But aside from that, for the last year and a half or so, it's all been remote. So I've had to rethink about, how do I sort of recreate that same process, or how do I have that kind of serendipitous collision? Because virtual gatherings, they often focus on the presentations, but don't have like the hallway conversations like we would have when we would actually go to one of these different conferences, where people would commit to being there, but maybe not be committed to going into a session. It's really hard to kind of have that same type of environment. Actually, the best thing that I've seen that's been able to recreate that was something like Burning Man, where there are like not as many talks, but it's more about world hopping and exploring the different experiences. And that was a place where I would start to run into people more organically, much in a similar fashion that I would at an actual conference. So in the wake of the pandemic, I've had to rethink a lot about how I do that as a process. But during that first part of capturing some of those different interviews, it was a lot of just going to the event, trying to be aware of what the different people that I want to talk to, but kind of let the themes organically emerge based upon who I happen to run into and who I happen to have a conversation with. And luckily, a lot of people over the years knew who I was. And so it was a part where a lot of people may have known who I was, but I don't know them. And so there's this information asymmetry, but I would just generally make myself available. And then it would be a great opportunity for me to kind of learn about what other people were doing within the community.
So you've had the pleasure of visiting a lot of rooms in the metaverse. I'll say that. What are the challenges, the differences between real life and metaverse in terms of the a real world event? And what's the main differences there? Are there some benefits? Are there some negatives?
Well, so the benefits are that you get more access to people who may have not been able to be there. The downside, I think, is that a lot of people are not as committed to attending, like, say, a day-long experience or even 2 or 3 days long, where they're in the VR headset for 8 to 10 to 14 hours a day. The exception that I think is probably within the VR chat community, where people spend dozens of hours in VR. They have long extended periods of their tolerance of how much they spend in VR. So the prefabs community did a conference called the TLX conference. It was built within VR chat by ORELS One, and that community, the prefabs community, they have that full commitment that they're going to be make themselves available to be there. And that's something that having that full commitment of being fully immersed is something that I haven't seen in very many other communities so far, because I think most people see that doing a 2D, Zoom talk is going to be good enough for what people are really looking for. So there's other conferences, I think, in VR chat, like there's a Furality, which is a furry convention that happened in VR chat. And I think that there's some people in VR, not in people just in 2D and interfacing with each other. But that was another conference that I would say where you have a lot more of that organic people kind of being in that place. Burning Man is opening tomorrow, or opening up on Sunday at 11:30 a.m.
Is that the second Burning Man doing
Yeah,
the same?
Right, the Burning Man from 2021. The last year was the first year that it went virtual. This year's also going virtual, and so there's a number of different multiverse locations, and Altspace VR is one of the ones that is going to have the Burning Man again. So I'd say the Burning Man is another place where people were fully committed to, having this immersive experience, and a lot of people who would maybe normally go to Burning Man who bought their VR headset. So it's also I think the overarching thing that I've seen is this invitation. Priya Parker wrote a book called The Art of the Gathering, and a big part of making a successful gathering is having a very strong invitation for people that when you go there, that you're going to be able to either learn information or be able to interact with other people. If I were to try to abstract it at the most base level, for me, as an example, I would go to a conference with the intention of learning information about what's happening in the community. And then there's people in the community that are doing amazing stuff, and they have the intention to share what they're working on. So we are able to collide and collaborate, where I am able to ask them questions and they're able to give me information. And there's this mutual sharing of each of our intentions that we want to do are then fulfilled by colliding and meeting with each other. So part of the magic of meeting and going to gatherings is that you always have some intention of something that you want to make, but you may not be able to do it by yourself. You may need a piece of information. You may need to find a collaborator. You may need to find funding, but that as you gather, you're able to maybe have those collisions where you're able to meet up and kind of have this concrescence of that moment where you're able to fulfill your desires and they're able to fulfill their desires. And I think so. When I think about gatherings generally, I think that's at the heart. That's what's happening, is that people are coming together and they need to, collaborate and cooperate with each other in some fashion. A lot of it's around information exchange, but I think as we go forward, we're going to see much more ways in which that the world itself is the type of setting a deeper context for what type of conversations and gatherings can happen. One of the things that I haven't seen as much would be to say build an entire world where you have like say a section of like here's all the people that are interested in say immersive storytelling, here's all the people who are interested in VR education, and to just have that world where people are just kind of going in and at any moment they could be able to, kind of like when they go to Reddit or a forum, have people kind of generally hanging out, because most of the internet we have today is asynchronous. But the problem with gathering in virtual environments is that there's a certain amount of synchrony that needs to happen. So most of the successful things that I've seen have been, here's an invitation to gather at this point, at this time, and then we're going to talk about this thing. So that's kind of like the Clubhouse model. But with that conference, it's also like we're going to have this talk about, at this time, and we're going to be talking about this topic. And then you go to see that, and maybe there's something that afterwards. But just generally setting this sort of intentional field or this context where people kind of go and organically kind of meet up with each other is something that I think is at the frontiers of virtual gathering. It's not something that I've seen as much happen yet.
Well, there's a big part of your interest is the ethics behind VR, and I suppose this really crosses borders into AI as well, because fundamentally what you're describing is possibly an AI engine understanding, recording, and seeing what's going on with your wants, needs, what you can offer, what the other people want, and then bringing people together organically, automatically. Is that a scary thought to you, or is that just something you think will organically evolve into?
Well, I mean, this gets into certainly an ethical issue in terms of, what degree do I want to have an AI that's trying to figure that out for me? I don't know if I want that, because I think there's limits in terms of how much these types of virtual assistants or AI,
Virtual assistants.
yeah, the virtual assistants, and how much the virtual assistant could, how much you want them to be fully contextually aware of everything that's happening, because the benefit, I mean, there's a trade-off between what are you losing and what are you gaining. What you're losing is your sense of privacy, because anything that's recorded or tracked by a third party has no reasonable expectation to remain private according to the US government, which means that if there's an AI bot that's tracking all that stuff, what happens when the US government goes and say, okay, tell me everything that Kemp has been interested in, and that they don't, because it's given to a third party and within the Fourth Amendment in the United States, that's trying to protect, unreasonable search and seizures. Well, when you give data to a third party, then you basically are nullifying any sort of like, privacy that you have around that, because you give it to a third party, then there's no reasonable expectation for that to remain private, which means that the government can essentially get access to it without really asking for it. They don't need to really get a warrant. It's kind of doesn't have the same constitutional protections. So because of that, then you're essentially creating a situation where you have these companies that are gathering and have all this additional context and information about our identity, our ways in which that we want to take action in the world. And this is what Raphael has created a whole neurorights, saying, this technology is on this roadmap and able to eventually be able to violate in our rights to privacy, our right to identity, and our right to agency and autonomy. So there's a trade-off there between to what degree are you making decisions based on your own volition versus how much these contextually aware AI and all this virtual environments is tracking everything and making a model, a digital twin of us, and then slightly nudging us towards things that other people within the market context are kind of paying for to be able to slightly modify my behavior. So I think at the core, the way that John Burkhart frames it in the episode 1000 and also one of the Voices of VR podcast, he's like, we know that at some point that's going to be unethical in terms of the kind of subtly changing people's behaviors and maybe tapping into the fixed action patterns. So like these automatic behavioral responses that you might be able to chain them together to be able to really start to drive somebody and almost kind of control them like a marionette. Like we know at that extreme level that's going to be unethical, but we don't know at what point that is unethical. Is it unethical just to kind of like, put an ad there? Or is it, like the technologies are going to get so sophisticated to be able to track ourselves, then the ethical line between when that becomes okay and not okay is like that's where the unknown ethical threshold is. And we can see at the extreme it's unethical, but we don't know if we're making these kind of incremental changes at what point that's going to kind of swap over and suddenly start to undermine our rights to identity, our rights to agency, and our right to mental privacy. So our thoughts that we're having in our mind that are, we part of this is the right to free speech, and part of the right to free speech is that you have the decision as to what you are disclosing. And if you have something that is reading your mind and all your actions, and it's deciding what your identity is, what your preferences are, and all these things, then that's sort of undermining your ability to disclose that to other people. And it's sort of putting that into a third party's hands. And I think for me, I'm just generally a little bit more skeptical that that's a good idea, and that that's something that I want, because there's so many of the trade-offs that we don't know what the implications are. If there's a big giant database of all my likes and dislikes and everything that I've experienced in VR, what happens if that gets leaked onto the dark web and that gets into the hands of a hostile nation state or somebody who's, just a rogue actor that I didn't have the amount of contextual integrity, meaning that may be shared within an original context, but what happens if that data escapes out and gets into the hands where all of a sudden then that's a new context of, kind of a state foreign actor that's trying to subtly manipulate and control elections in different ways. There may be ways in which that's happening that we're not even consciously aware of. And so I think, if we look at all the different foils of social media, that's going to be kind of amplified up to this whole nother level.
Yeah,
so I
are
think
we not already there? Are we not already there? Are you not feeling that your life is already a bubble? I mean, the people you follow on Twitter, which is presumably some of your life, and the news items you see are highly curated bubble of your perspective, because you'll sort of naturally reject people you don't want to listen to. You'll amplify people you do like listening to. And then, even simple things like, searching on Google, for instance, is very much a perspective of you. If you allow it to track you, it will return results that are more meaningful for you as an individual. And, if you're searching for Egypt in the US and then you go to Egypt and search for Egypt things, the results are going to be vastly different based on your contextual location. And ad brainwashing's been around for years. I know you've mentioned it recently in the show, but is this not already here now and starting, and the increments are so relatively tiny that we don't even realize we're in our own, brainwashed state, so to speak? Is that real?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a fair assessment that they were already there. And I'd say it's already maybe gone too far. So then if it's already gone too far, then are we going to not change anything and then make it even worse as we move forward? So at what point do we sort of reel it back a little bit? And the degree to which that these companies and their algorithms are, like, there isn't a lot of algorithmic transparency in all the ways in which that we are interfacing with the outside world, especially during the pandemic, is so algorithmically driven. So to what degree that all these companies have access and control over our mental space, and to what degree is that going to become even more as we move forward? And there's no transparency, no algorithmic transparency, and no recourse for what is the relationship between us as consumers and citizens of our countries, but also just as people in these companies that have been gaining more and more power. And I think this is the realm of tech policy where you have different layers in which that there's the culture, and then you have the laws, and then you have the economic dynamics, and then you have the underlying technological architecture and the code. And the ethical questions are around how do you, address things that are cultural issues that are going to happen from what people are deciding as a culture, versus what the laws are, versus what the economic market dynamics are, versus what the underlying technological architecture is. And that any sufficiently complicated ethical issue is going to be a combination of all of those things. And so when you look at what Thomas Metzinger has called the technology pacing gap, meaning that the technology is moving way faster than those higher levels of the technology policy to be able to understand what's happening, and then to be able to kind of shift the dial to be able to modulate it so that we're kind of in these areas where we're in kind of right relationship between all these two. And there's not too much power asymmetry between having these big tech companies having undue amount of influence on how culture is being shaped. And we are in a place where we have these technology companies and their algorithms that are already creating filter bubbles of reality, that are already, having market-driven dynamics that are driving certain behaviors, whether it's outrage and engagement, or different things around misinformation, or different things that you definitely argue that we're already in that sort of dystopic place. And VR, I think, is only going to make it way worse. It's not going to, or it may make it better, but unless the underlying sort of power dynamics and relationships are changed, then how do we, as citizens and as people, start to have some say, some democratic say, or have some more control or agency in our lives, whether it's turning off the algorithmic, filters, or, escaping out of this, filter bubble of reality that's being driven by these tech companies. I think that's one of the biggest questions. And, for me, with that relationship between the culture, the laws, the economy, and the underlying tech architecture, at some point it may be that the only thing that we can really do as a collective is to, well, either say, well, we're going to not use this consumer technology because we're going to, as a group of citizens, vote with our dollars, and we're not going to support this. Or it may be like with Oculus, they're really only the biggest game in town when it comes to standalone VR. Well, if there's not any market competition, then at what point do you start to look at antitrust laws, or do you start to look at other ways that you need to have, say, a federal privacy law in the United States to be able to regulate what type of data you can collect and what type of stuff you can do with it? I think that's a type of discussions that we will eventually need to have, and it may need to have the government stepping in to do stuff. Because as sort of citizens, we're not sort of equipped to be able to make a consumer choice, but it needs to happen at a larger level. So that's, I guess, my response is that you really need to kind of look at the full picture, but also be aware of some of these different dynamics. And as we move forward, I think these different types of conversations are only going to get more and more part of the larger XR community. And what are the kind of tech policy solutions to say, hey, okay, this is an issue that can be addressed by the technological architecture, or this is something that we should let the market decide. This is something that we really need to have the government step in and really protect citizens, because the market's not going to decide for themselves to do this. Versus what is, as people, what are we going to do as collectives to be able to maybe make choices that are going to support a world that we want to create, above and beyond what other entities are able to do for us.
And this isn't just words. You are actively, the Global Initiative on Ethics for Extended Reality is a child of yours.
I was definitely a part of helping to create it, but I'm on the executive committee member, and I was, head of the white paper committee for this. It's the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality. It's an industry connections group as part of the IEEE Standards Association, and that's been going for, I think, about a year now. And yeah, I've been involved with the different discussions, and there's been a white paper to start to talk about some of these different issues, these ethical issues. And then there's another policy track that's starting to look at, okay, because there's ethical design from what we can do as VR creators and makers. So what are the ethical decisions that creators need to make? And then there's some decisions, like I said, they're going to be outside of the hands of the creators, and that really need to go for what the tech policy needs to be. And I think, the thing that I'd say is that, these are all volunteer-driven efforts, and there's lots of different lobbying committees and perspectives on some of these different issues. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to take people, trying to create these conceptual models, and then at some point saying, is there something that the government needs to do to be able to step in and control things? And I guess I've come up with a little bit more of a skepticism in watching things over the last number of years, meaning that I don't expect the government to be able to step in and save us on any of these things. Maybe, well, aside from, there was news, just, rumors this week that TikTok may be buying Pico VR. So what happens if ByteDance, who runs TikTok, now all of a sudden owns a VR headset, which a lot of the medical XR folks have been using for, because the Oculus Quest is not HIPAA compliant. Because of that, then you have what happens then if this other VR headset, Pico VR, which is probably the closest to the standalone competitor. It's based out of China, but what happens if it's run by a government, a company that's based in China that then some of that same privacy issues now all of a sudden, rather than just becoming a matter of sort of a corporate interest, now it becomes an issue of national security, because then all of a sudden you have, the Chinese government having some sort of connection that may have a direct line between some of this immersive data that's being collected by a VR machine. What if that's going straight into the hands of the Chinese government? Does that change the larger discussion around privacy? And then does that mean that we're going to get some sort of federal privacy law that's going to be in reaction to all of the XR industry? Or because ultimately what I saw happen here in the United States is that the Trump administration, when he was in power, saw all the sort of threats of what was going to happen with TikTok, and then basically did a very isolated thing just for that one company. And at the end of the day, I don't think it did much. It's sort of like they didn't actually have ownership within the United States, and they just kind of, whatever that one-off solution, let's call it a one-off solution to kind of address that as a threat, is a lot different than say, let's solve this problem at the core level of what we need to have everybody in the United States follow, or everybody that we want to do business with us. So if there was a federal law that was talking about some of these different privacy issues, then that could both address some of the different concerns that we may have someone with a foreign nation state having an immersive technology, versus if it's a law that's sort of having everybody in the industry that has to follow. So I would love to have something that would be kind of more of a global standard to say, here's maybe this is data, like biometric data, that we shouldn't be monetizing. We shouldn't be collecting it. We shouldn't be kind of using it because maybe that collection of data, maybe it's should be considered medical data, or maybe the type of information is going to be too intimate. We're going to have too much information about what's happening. Let's say like eye tracking, or I think Facebook themselves has stepped away from brain control interfaces because I think they're maybe afraid of the implications of being able to read your brain waves, and don't want to have the VR headset maybe seen as a medical device and regulated as a medical device, or have the data be regulated as medical data. So I think, we're in this phase right now where it's a little still like the Wild West, and we have to put a lot of trust and faith that these companies are going to self-regulate and do the right thing. But my fear is that it's going to kind of go out and people are going to, adopt all the technology, and there's going to be a little bit of like a boiling the frog in a pot situation where they're going to get this out to a certain network effect scale, penetration, and then they're going to sort of turn on all this stuff that are going to be a lot more of the evil aspects of kind of invading our privacy. So yeah, I think it's something that as we move forward, it's one of the things that is one of my deeper fears in terms of where this all goes. And I've just been trying to do my best to kind of both map it out, but also, talk about some of these different dynamics and what can we really feasibly do about it.
I want to give a tiny bit of context to that, because I think it's really important to show the context of how big of a problem this is. I suppose first of all, I can give context myself. I'm an active member of the UK UKIE, which is for a games industry group body that works with the government, etc., in the UK. And I was at one of our VRXR meetings, and the subject of tracking, hand tracking, eye tracking, started. We had a couple of lawyers at the table. We started the discussion, and it immediately started exploding into a list which you've pretty much captured. So I'm going to share it. I'll just put it on the screen now. Of how many areas this starts to touch inside XR. The majority of these don't cross over into real life. There's certainly a lot that do, but when you start to think about cryptocurrency and blockchain things, identity, looking for behavioral patterns that are psychology things, PTSD treatment, all the health, and obviously you can't read this, it's a podcast, but there is enormous amounts of umbrella. It takes you probably 20 minutes in some show just to talk at a top level through the words. When you dig into any one of these things, it's a complicated more than complicated. It's a deep. There are legal ramifications. There are lots of things that are just scary. And are you not worried as well that even if you start to touch at some of these, actually understanding and policing this has become almost impossible?
Well, I think what's worth noting here is that these are a number of different contextual domains, or the domains of human experience in which some of these issues are coming up. And whether or not we had VR technology or not, a lot of the issues in technology are coming up here already. And that what happens with immersive technology is that sometimes it provides solutions to some of those problems, but other times it also introduces even more intractable problems on top of that. So that's sort of the nature, the dilemma of like to be able to solve a problem, you come up with a robust solution to solve it, but then it potentially introduces a problem that's even more complicated. So this is, I think, an ongoing progress of human development where any tool could also be used as a weapon. And it's that sort of contextual use of how you use that tool that really comes into the question. And I think that, when I talk to philosophers and they talk about ethics and they talk about because John Burkhardt said, this unknown ethical threshold of privacy in terms of when is it okay or not okay. And I was talking to, I went to a philosophy conference and I was talking to some, tech ethicist philosophers, and he's like, well, that's the story of all of philosophy and the story of all ethics is that it's never going to be a clear line about what is okay or not okay. And part of the reason why it's never a clear line is because all these different contextual domains, you can never live into the full ultimate potential of every single one of those domains because they're mutually exclusive. They kind of trade off of each other. So a good example is like privacy and safety. Like if you want to have the most safe environment, then you would track everything and you would say anything you would have go wrong, you'd be able to have a record of it. But if you have a record of everything, then you're giving up a certain amounts of your freedom and your liberty because everything that you do is being tracked. So you have to trade off between to what degree are you going to have some of that tracking or social scores, which a lot of these, we talk about the social score within China where they have numbers for each people. Well, guess what? Every single sophisticated social VR application has a number for you that they track invisibly. It's an invisible social score, but that's what they use to be able to detect to what degree that you are an abusive actor or not. Whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or any sort of social VR application also has developed some of these different social scores. So we talk about social scores, in the context of that world, that's okay. But what happens if that social score then it gets adopted by the government and the government's then all of a sudden getting all of your social scores for all your social media, and they have like an official social score from the US government that is now all of a sudden dictating whether or not you can have access to whether or not you're traveling or whether or not you can buy or, get onto a train or something. It's so there's ways
some of this does exist. I mean,
Yes.
we are being, I don't know, your financial status has got a score.
Yeah.
And if you walk down an average high street, in fact, forget a high street, walk down any street, almost anywhere, you can spot 10 cameras, a number of cameras, all that have got microphones on, looking for, and applied AI against these things, looking for things like doing good. In London, we've recently had some, I say recently, a few years ago, we had a spat of horrific incidents where there was like guns and stabbings and things. And the microphones are picking these up and alerting and getting police there really, really quick. That's a good thing, right? But we are being listened to all the time as part of the side effect of having these good things. Is that not just naturally going to spill over into the metaverse third world and have similar?
Yeah, and I think that sort of reiterates my point, which is that, if you were to have, complete and total privacy of everything that was happening, then, you may have no recourse to be able to track, human trafficking or sex trafficking or child pornography or illegal transfer of funds for terrorists. I mean, there's certain debates that even happen within sort of peer-to-peer encryption, which allows people to have the safety of being able to communicate with each other, but also could sort of protect people who are bad actors from being detected. So I think for any of these different issues, and I think that this sort of mapping of all these different contexts, I think you can see how there's different things that are trading off of each other. Like I said, it's like when I made this and I was like, okay, here is like my, XR ethics manifesto that I first presented back in October of 2019 at the Greenlight Strategy Conference in San Francisco. And I had spent the last, 9 months really doing this deep dive into ethics and trying to understand and map out all these different contextual domains. And at the end of it, when I did my manifesto, I was like, wow, this is really sort of in the platonic realm of ideal forms, like something that's a great to strive for, but pragmatically and practically, no one could ever actually achieve it because there's certain aspects of these that are impossible to sort of fully, live into all the potential. So I think each company, each website is going to have their own take for how to balance those different trade-offs. And I think the important thing is to have a diversity of different opinions for how different options that you have available, so that it's not just like one or two companies that are making a decision that then all of a sudden sort of dictates these social spaces that that are driving the different cultural behaviors that are okay or not okay. Because one of the challenges, I think, is that when we think about public space within a certain country, usually that public space is owned by the U.S. government or the government of that country. We don't have the equivalent idea of public space within the context of the virtual world. Maybe the closest is something like a peer-driven, community-supported like Wikipedia, which is sort of like but it's still owned by a private company. They still have their own terms of service. So there's not really, as far as I know, certainly are probably government-run websites that have public spaces, but when you think about immersive metaverse spaces, like how many immersive metaverse spaces can you think of that really would constitute a public space, meaning that it's sort of owned by a government or owned by the people? I think, peer-driven websites will certainly maybe see a little bit more of that as we move forward, as to how people are going to self-organize. And maybe this is where we get into cryptocurrency and other kind of contracts where people are able to kind of cryptographically make those different types of decisions about what kind of world they want to create based upon those agreements. But I think as we move forward, I think it's important to see that we need a diversity of these different types of approaches, and not just one company, but have many different options for how they're going to sort of navigate these various different trade-offs that are just going to be embedded into the nature of the technology. Just as we have on the web, there's a diversity of different approaches where you can, get access to different perspectives or different, rules around what kind of free speech is okay and what is not okay, and what kind of safe online environments. This is probably the existential debate that we have on the 2D internet, but this is going to continue out into the wider internet. And for me, I guess it's kind of, take it back to VR and some of the policies that are being made. If you have a sort of code of conduct that is connected to the hardware, then that all of a sudden puts a certain situation where you could be not even using some of different websites or applications from Facebook, but if it violates the term of service because you use the headset, then does that all of a sudden allow Facebook to kind of revoke your access to that because you require a Facebook user ID, and because of that user ID, then all of a sudden that is sort of creating a baseline of what is okay or not okay. So being able to tie a certain policy from one individual company that has the entirety of all the XR ecosystem, I think is going to be, as we move forward, we're going to see a lot of problems with that, because I think it's not, I don't think it's a great idea to sort of, it sort of ruins a lot of that effort towards diversity that you really want to have in a robust marketplace when you have that type of control over the hardware of the technology being tied to sort of a social media account that is also tied to a code of conduct that allows Facebook to kind of pull the plug if they wanted to sort of say, you did something on this other application that we're not even in control of, but it's so severe that we're going to yank and restrict access to all of your VR hardware access and basically take away all of your software. Usually that's only been like when you're on their website. Like if you go onto Facebook and you do something bad, then that could get your Facebook account in bad standing, and then you could lose all access to your Oculus account and all of your Oculus games. That's already like a questionable decision in terms of, like there's nothing that I can do on a website that's going to revoke access to my computer to be able to do my work. But if this is the future of computing, all of a sudden we're putting a lot of power into the hands of a single corporation based upon them being able to kind of snap their fingers and revoke access to your computing device.
So do you think it'll evolve into legal rights to equipment and platforms?
Well, this is where maybe right now, I think both technically Apple and Google could sort of do the same thing. Like they could you could do something on like Google Photos or something, or YouTube, and maybe it's so severe that you get your Google account revoked, which would essentially kind of functionally brick your Android iPhone. So this has already been kind of out there, but as we move forward and we have more and more reliance upon these mobile computing devices or AR or VR headsets, to have this like go back to a single user account on a that's owned by a single company, I think is going to not be a great idea. Like I want to have the right to be able to own a piece of hardware and then I own it and I'm able to do whatever I want with it. But I think even the iPhone has certain, like I guess you can, I don't know if it's legal to sort of jailbreak your iPhone, but certain ways that at a baseline, I think if you own a piece of hardware, you should be able to treat it like it's independent of all these other things. You should at least maintain your access to that piece of hardware.
But I mean,
So yeah,
well, software licensing for, God, probably tens of years now has been a rental agreement. Majority of software licensing
right.
is you don't own it; it's a rental agreement, and it's not your property anyway. And yeah, it's a difficult. Yeah, I think I do see a world where rights to access become a real thing. And identities and personas, is that, I mean, obviously we're in sort of the birth of what people are coining the metaverse, or I prefer to think of it mentally like the third space. We sort of got work, home, and this third space you hang out. And there's a big fight for this space, right? People's time, really, fundamentally, where there is a shift, and it's not that transparent. Like we're not talking about millions of people in VR headsets suddenly disappearing into the oasis somewhere. There's a natural shift of people moving into online spaces. So there's things like playing games online. We can probably cite 10 different products that have tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of people playing them right now in virtual spaces. And they're not necessarily even playing the game, they're just hanging out with their friends in virtual spaces. Obviously, there's been huge rises to success there with things like Epic's games as Fortnite, and there's a few a bit closer to heart for us. There's great success in things like Rec Room, and then there's other products out there doing a similar thing. These are all third spaces people are hanging out in socially. Is it apparent that these metaverse spaces and third spaces are becoming so prevalent, and that's why they're being traced?
That's why they're being traced. What do you mean?
Chased. That's why the big guys are wanting to grab their chunk of land in this virtual space.
Well, I mean, I think that there are certain ways in which that in order to sustain this, you're going to have some business model. And I think there's some questions around whether or not we're going to have completely new business models, or we're going to maybe adapt the existing business models that are coming from existing platforms. But to take a step back in terms of why I think people are going into these spaces, I think that the sense of immersion, the sense of presence, Mel Slater talks about the two illusions, the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. And so you feel like you're in the place and that what is happening is plausible and real. And that, in the context of a pandemic where a lot of people are maybe still sheltered at home or restricted in the ways in which that they're going and interacting with other people in these shared social spaces. So these virtual worlds, I think, especially for people who are young and their kids, stuff like Roblox and Minecraft and certainly Rec Room has experienced an enormous amount of growth, especially as they've had 2D portal interfaces on things like Xbox and PlayStation and Android and iPhone. I mean, of all the different virtual worlds that I know in terms of that have VR implementations, I think Rec Room probably has the most users of all of the different sort of metaverse spaces, aside from, say, Fortnite or Minecraft or Roblox, which obviously have more users in the millions. But in terms of VR-enabled worlds, I think Rec Room is probably by far the biggest and probably second VR chat. So these worlds, I think as we go into them, we have different qualities of presence. And I talk about like mental and social presence, so to be able to actually interact with people, embodied presence, to have this sense of having an embodied sense of yourself, but also the world around you, emotional presence, and so ways in which that there's emotional immersion, whether it's through music or through immersive storytelling or sort of the building and releasing of consonance and dissonance cycles to be able to kind of give you this feeling of engaging your emotions. And then finally, there's the active presence, so you actually sort of taking action and expressing your agency in some fashion. So I think, these worlds, like Philip Rosedale said, these virtual worlds are gonna be as complex as, the real world. And so as we go into these worlds, we're going to be able to have different types of experiences that are just as sophisticated as you would have in real life with other people. And that there's enough of the, I guess, there's a technicality here in terms of virtual reality, because as we say virtual reality, we kind of invoke in our mind that it's like a binary dichotomy between virtual and real, and that somehow the virtual is not as real. But I would sort of challenge that as like maybe a bad naming of virtual reality that's sort of based upon a metaphysical assumption of substance metaphysics, meaning that the only stuff that's real is sort of concrete, hard stuff that you can sort of touch. But I think that I'm a fan of a paradigm shift philosophically into something like process philosophy that tends to see the nature of reality in terms of our relationships between the entities that we have in our field. And so, and these processes that are dynamic and unfolding and in flux rather than something that's static and concrete. So as we go into virtual worlds, we're able to kind of evoke different relational dynamics of our brain. That's kind of like, the predictive coding theory of neuroscience says that, we are having these mental models of the world. And there's something about the VR technologies that's able to kind of stimulate different aspects of those mental models that get close enough of approximation that gives us a similar type of phenomenological feeling as if we're actually there. So because of that, I think we're sort of on this roadmap of kind of replicating different aspects of reality into these virtual simulations, and because of that, I mean, there's certain limitations in terms of resources that we have access to different types of human experience. Well, what this is showing, this sort of vision of the metaverse, and this process of creating these virtual simulations, is that it is somehow going to be able to potentially replicate the core essence of a lot of the core range of experiences that are possible in the human experience, but we're limited by our access to sort of the physical materials to be able to facilitate that. So because of that, I think we're kind of in this paradigm shift that I at least see as, the equivalent of, say, the Gutenberg press in the 1454, which was kind of a new communications medium that books proved to be a way of capturing information and knowledge in a way that kind of set the tone for that 500 years. And then film came along, and I think we're starting to move from more of the sort of linear written model into sort of more image based at the turn of the century. We start to have the 20th century is, I'd say, like the century of film. But in the middle of that, you have computer technologies that are allowing us to be able to kind of have a digital Gutenberg press. So I see computing technologies as like the Gutenberg press of our era. And because it's the new Gutenberg press, I'm going to say, like, for the next 500 years, it's going to be really driven by immersive computing, digital simulations that are able to kind of start to, just as books were able to capture information and knowledge, I'd say that, these immersive computing and AI and cryptocurrencies, everything else, the whole range of computer mediated technologies and digital technologies are able to capture the essence of the human experience. And because of that, that's like a compelling, new communications medium that I think is going to really dictate the way that we are kind of relating to each other for, the far future until we have the next computing medium, which, by that time, who knows, maybe it will get into, who knows what's going to be possible 500 years from now. It's hard. We can only just see what the potential of VR is, and maybe even doing direct neural injection by, 2045 or something like that. If we're able to kind of do and stimulate parts of our brains that go beyond what we can do from, both our visual and auditory, but, our taste and our touch or smell. Is that going to be ways that we can sort of, directly stimulate the brain, or are we going to be limited by what we can do from our external stimuli and sort of reach this point of, being able to always sort of differentiate between the virtual and the real? Jaron Lanier, his theory is that we're always going to be able to differentiate between the kind of virtual simulation versus the real, and whether or not we're going to be able to create realities that are literally indistinguishable from the IRL reality or not. I don't know. That's yet to be seen in terms of the progression of the technology. But Lanier is more of a skeptic in terms of that, moving towards something to be able to kind of do this indistinguishable reality, that we're always going to be able to kind of slightly tell the difference, and that our perceptual systems will be able to be refined and develop over time for us to be able to tell the difference between the virtual world, which then is going to allow us to kind of like perceive reality in a more deep way. So either way, I think, why are these metaverse technologies so compelling? Well, I think we're kind of moving into this space where they're going to be able to kind of replicate, the whole range of the human experience and give us access to stuff that we'd never be able to have access to otherwise.
Is it not? I mean, it's an interesting conversation I've had so many times now about human augmentation. Is it not just? It's not just likely. It is more than plausible. It is 100% at some point. Augmentation of a human becomes so close to replicating whatever you're imagining that it's just inevitable. I mean, things in our very short time. I mean, I wish we'd have had this conversation 5 years ago. Where's VR going to be in 5 years' time, and recorded it and had that conversation. You've probably got some podcasts like that. I'm pretty sure there were a lot of things that were predicted. I'm pretty sure that we're probably, like everything, we were probably had some big ambitions, but at this point in time, a lot of those came true. And we are just on one planet in a universe full of millions and millions of planets. There is a likelihood, albeit probably a small one, that there is a universe somewhere 50 years behind us or 50 years ahead. And that is all not just plausible, it's likely, it's probably real. And as time goes on, fixing people's ailments is becoming reasonable expectation. Personalization of health is becoming reasonable and expectational. Won't it just creep up on us? If your eyesight goes, there'll be some alternative eyesight implementation that they can do to save your eyesight, and it will sort of creep up on us rather than just bam, suddenly you can have digital eyeballs. Is that all going to happen? How's your feelings on that?
Well, I think, Jaron Lanier, his theory is that we'll always be able to tell the difference, that he doesn't sort of buy into the sort of indistinguishable nature of reality. Android Jones also comments on from his own perspective as a visionary artist, as well as someone who has, had a lot of psychedelic experiences. He's like, to be able to recreate the molecular reality of reality within a simulation is, maybe you'll be able to sort of do an AI synthesis version of that, but to sort of get to the granular level of molecular reality, it's sort of a, what are the computational limits? And,
but didn't we think, I mean, if we go back a very short period of time, let's say 5 years ago, and I said to you, within 5 years, there'll be a car there'll be an average car you can buy and it will drive around San Francisco on its own. You'd have probably said, well, maybe, John, but it sounds a bit out there. And yet here we are 5 years later, and there are numerous examples of that and it's accelerating at a pace that is, quite frankly, shocking. Is that not just a small example of the acceleration into, setting difficult challenges for computers with AI, machine learning? And we've not even got close to quantum computers being practical in reality, but they're coming, right? We're on a path where that will be reality at some point, instant resolving or instant or nigh on instant variable calculations to work through AI. Is it not just we're on a path, it's happening?
So the point that Mel Sater makes is that our experience within VR, these senses of presence, they're an illusion. There's a part of your brain that still understands that this is sort of a simulation, that it's not actually real. Now, is there going to be a point in the future where we have a mediated experience that we forget that we're in a virtual environment, or that we sort of are able to suspend our disbelief to the point where it functionally feels just as immersive, just as real? I think we've certainly had social VR experiences, like, just us talking right here. It feels like we're across from a table and have this conversation, right? So there's certain contexts that we're going to have. And I think this question as to what point are the simulations going to accurately replicate reality one-to-one, so it's not able to be distinguished by our perception. Maybe that's a technological inevitability. Or, what Jaron Lanier says is that what's going to happen is that our perceptual our ability to be able to notice the nuances is going to continue to evolve along the side with it, so that we'll always be able to sort of discern the virtual and the real.
Could be explaining those that can pick up ghosts and sensitive to electromagnetism there, etc. I mean, there are lots of reasons why you could have, I mean, taking that basic presumption, why wouldn't there be a higher level outside of this simulation that we don't concept, because those neurons in the brain have actually been switched off on purpose in order to keep us at this current AI level?
Well,
It's really
I mean, that's sort
interesting
of presuming that we're at a like in a, you know, we're in a simulation already. I think what I would sort of put forth is that, like, say, a good example is like when you go into, like, say, a group meditation. I don't know if you've ever meditated in a group like that, or if you go into like a concert where you feel the energy of the room, right? There's something about the shared space that we have with other human beings that happens when we're co-located with each other, where the virtual experience of that may be different than the augmented reality version where you're actually physically there with people. Now, are you going to be able to sort of replicate the feeling of being around all those different dimensions of human consciousness within having that sense of shared space with other people? There's something etheric that can't be sort of modeled. You know, there's certain ways in which that maybe things can only happen within the virtual, or only can happen in real life when you're sort of physically co-located. That's why I think that there's going to be certain things that you will need to actually be there to have. Like, say, someone cooks you a meal and the meal is cooked at a certain time, and you share the same flavor with everybody and it's precisely the same. You know, I mean, like, there's things like that where, in the short term at least, I mean, we can think about like Amara's law, and how Amara's law talks about how, you know, in the short term we tend to overpredict and overhype things, but in the long term we tend to underestimate the potentials. And so maybe there's a dimension which in the long term we're sort of, you know, I'm underestimating where things are going to go technologically. But I think, you know, I suspect that there's going to be certain things that you are going to actually need to be in real life for, and those will be things that we do AR for. And there's going to be things that are going to be, or maybe they'll just be better. Maybe you could sort of replicate enough, but it's never going to be quite 100%. And so people will still decide to go be IRL because that's an experience that they get that's more visceral in some fashion. Because I think that, you know, it's just Gödel's incompleteness. Gödel, you know, had this sort of theorem that things can be either consistent or complete, and maybe there's certain ways in which that the Gödel and like simulations will kind of run into Gödel incompleteness unavoidably, whereas in reality, maybe it doesn't sort of face the same type of incompleteness because reality is itself incomplete and hard to be able to be modeled comprehensively. So this gets into a lot of the deeper philosophical questions, and I guess my perspective is that there's always going to be limits to the simulation, and that we're always
Hasn't that
going
been proved as well? Isn't quantum observing quantum particles? In observing them, don't they change? Wouldn't that show us that
there's stuff like that that maybe
at the edge it only gets formed if you're observing it?
right.
Sort of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interpretations for the quantum measurement problem and what exactly is going on there. I mean, there's Everett's many world interpretations, but, you know, the Copenhagen interpretation or the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation does have some affordance for human consciousness interacting with the collapsing of the wave function. So and I think process philosophy has this concept of potential. Like, the lack of potential means that that all of the universe has already happened, like the sort of the breadbox of the universe and Einstein, like this sort of a deterministic universe that's already happened. There's nothing that we can do and make choices that are going to change the course of how the universe is already going to unfold because it's already determined how things have unfolded. We're just sort of robots playing out scripts. It's sort of like the mainstream physics of general relativity of how they can sort of conceive of time. The opposite way, I think, of thinking that, and what I think the quantum realm starts to integrate, are these concepts of potential and this fact that the world is still in the making, which is what, you know, Matt Siegel, the process philosopher, includes some quotes from him, sort of contrasting this sort of simulation theory idea that maybe there's something that as human beings, as the world is unfolding, we are participating in the unfolding of the universe, and that we are actually participating in some sort of metaphysical underlying level how reality is being constructed moment to moment. And that is I think, a metaphor of moving in from a passive reality into a sort of participatory reality. I do think that we're moving from more of a sort of passive consumption into more active participatory reality. Now, how far metaphysically does that go? Does that go down into the construction of the universe moment to moment at a quantum level? I don't know. It could. But if it does, then I think that's an argument that's against sort of us being able to sort of model things. When you sort of get down to that core level of what's emerging at a core.
Is there a test for it? I mean, for human likeness, this Turing test. Is there a Kent test for
Well,
the third space being as close to reality as possible?
I think so there are different things where you could say, Rift into the Mind has talked about different psychedelic substances. Like if you take ketamine with VR, I've never tried this out, but what they say is that there's ways that you can maybe chemically alter your brain chemistry to the point where you are accepting the virtual reality as reality versus some sort of maybe part of your brain that's sort of skeptical around it not really taking it in. So I think there will be ways in which people kind of accept have a perception of the reality as being real. But I don't know. I think, there may be, the Turing test in terms of shared social spaces or different events or different, like when I'm out here in Oregon.
I mean, that is getting pretty good. I mean, I remember the first Turing test discussed, and it was ridiculous what we were looking at from an avatar perspective. The best we could do was pretty bad, right? And then, fast forward a number of years, we can stand at OC and watch what they're doing with their research department on it. And then, MetaHumans has recently been released by Epic, and these things are getting pretty good, right? It won't be long before, a computer, and, there are real examples now of in film. I was watching a documentary the other day where it's they're using AI. I don't know. They brought Luke Skywalker back into a film, right? He's not young anymore, and yet there he was. He was in the film and moving around and acting in the. It's getting pretty good, and you can imagine projecting forward only a few years, but 5 years away, that Turing test is pretty much easily solvable on your mobile phone.
Well, I mean, when I went to the International Joint Conference of AI a number of years, 2016 and 18, I believe, I went to a number of different conferences and talking to AI researchers. And one of the things they talk about, that's around 2016, AI Magazine did a whole here are the Turing tests for 2050. So by 2050, what are the types of things that we want to be able to see to do where AI progresses to the point where it's very robust. It's not to the point of artificial general intelligence. Maybe, I mean, that's one, I guess, general Turing test. But one of the things they had was robots being able to play soccer and it being as compelling as the World Cup. So will you be able to have robots playing soccer against a world-class champion humans? And is that sort of the just as chess was the initial Turing test of or for the advancement of AI. Well, we've figured that out, but there's still a lot of kind of heuristic brute force aspects for what that is. And is something like robots playing soccer, is that going to be something that we're going to be able to achieve to the point where AI is sophisticated enough to be able to kind of compete against other humans at maybe a professional championship level? And then you can extrapolate all that out in terms of other things, common sense reasoning and, virtual. I mean, the big thing about the AI and sort of the uncanny valley, maybe we've been able to sort of surpass the uncanny valley when it comes to 2D projections, but the real challenge is that when you're interacting with another virtual being, do you get the sense that it's an actual human? And that sort of dynamic interaction and being able to sort of interrogate something. I think, within maybe 2050, we'll probably be at that point, or 2045, we'll sort of reach this point where interacting with virtual beings may be indistinguishable from interacting with human beings. So I do think that there's going to be this technological progression. I guess I really, the way that I end my episode 1000 when I talk about the ultimate potential of VR is with the quotes from Jaron Lanier and Tom Furness, who are kind of talking about how what Jaron Lanier says is that the real benefit of virtual reality is that when you take off the headset and it changes the way that you perceive reality. It goes back to what he was saying in terms of that as you change with virtual experiences, you're changing the neural pathways into your brain. And you're sort of blazing new neural pathways. And so when you take off your headset, you literally see the world in a new way. And it allows you to kind of have a new relationship to reality or appreciate different aspects of reality. And that's the same thing that Tom Furness told me back in 2015, which is that the ultimate potential of reality is reality. And that, there's things you can do in VR, but at the end of the day, we need to, I guess, be in right relationship to the world around us. And this process relational way of thinking, I think, is a big thing that informs me, which is saying that, this concept of being in right relationship, not only to ourselves and the world and to other people, but the world around us. And I think as long as what we're doing with these technologies maintains like integrity around being in right relationships with ourselves, being in right relationships to the people around us, but also in right relationships to the world. Because this dream of having this sort of replicating reality, like unless we're actually like taking care of the earth around us, it's not going to like. I would rather be in a world where we're actually like being good stewards of the earth rather than creating a situation where we have to sort of escape earth because we've destroyed it and we go to another planet like Mars that like if we destroyed earth, well, what's to think that unless we change something fundamental, if we go to Mars and sort of set up a whole sort of new habitats, that we wouldn't also destroy whatever we create there. So at the heart of it, I think we need to be in harmony with the world around us. And there's a lot of ways in that we're not actually doing that. And so until we sort of take care of that baseline, then I think as we sort of think about all these other technological things, then, it's an open philosophical question, I'd say. Whether or not, I don't think it's 100% inevitable. I think there is a potential where there always will be that sort of binary split, or we will always be able to make a differentiation. Our perception will be able to sort of maybe subtly notice the nuances of reality in a way that we were never able to notice before. That's yet to be determined. But
did you catch the Tesla robot when they unveiled it recently?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read. I just saw a picture of it.
Yeah, I was watching that. Actually, I wasn't watching it for that, but it was one of those one more things in the talking about AI with road driving, and the robot came out and did this amazing dance, and for 20 seconds I thought, wow, that is really impressive AI doing that, and then of course it turns out to be a real dancing human underneath the pretend robot, which is slightly embarrassing, but also incredibly clever of them because they totally believe, you could believe that Tesla would pull that off. That they've got world-leading engineers working on things, right? Do you think that it's a good thing that we're going to be embodying robots and doing that in real life? And does this cross with where's it start getting blurred? Are there these big portals between VR and AR, and actually things are spilling over into both worlds big time?
Well, I think when you think about as we move forward, how there's going to be a handful of these different corporations and companies that are going to potentially be the drivers of a lot of these technologies. And where I see the big challenges are the asymmetries of power, meaning that in order to develop certain AI algorithms, you need an incredible amount, millions of dollars of capital, but also the types of ways in which that, even making and training these takes a lot of computing resources, and then it has different ecological impact, right? So what's the ecological impact and who's benefiting and who's profiting off of that? Well, we have a world where it's being run largely, a lot of these technologies being directed and controlled and owned by a small handful of corporations. I think where I would love to see things go at some point is a little bit more peer-driven or cooperatively owned development of these different types of things. So AI that's developed by a community. I think in some ways OpenAI is doing this to some extent, but also training AI that is really thinking out about ourselves and what our interests are versus what the corporate interests may be. And that was came up in my episode 1000 a little bit. Lauren Lee McCarthy worked on a project called Beyond the Breakdown at Sundance of 2021. And it was about world building, but they had an AI that was really trying to pay attention to what was happening to people that were it was kind of facilitating a group conversation, and the AI was really trying to facilitate a collective intention and experience. Most of the AI that we have is kind of trying to sell us stuff, and it doesn't always have our best interest at hand. And so I think what's going to be important is that, we're obviously going to have certain aspects of that, but what I get excited about is the type of more cooperatively owned and cooperatively driven AI that maybe has other interests that go beyond just sort of the consumer capitalist context, but also, what if it's AI that's really trying to help us to grow and evolve as a human being? I know Mickey Siegel, who's one of the founders of consciousness hacking, was talking about this vision of AI that's paying attention to our body and tracking us with really intimate ways, but trying to give us the different types of transformative modalities and technologies and ideas and exercises and the whole range of different types of transformative technologies. What if we're able to kind of dynamically get that on a demand basis based upon what's happening in our emerging context? So that's what my response in terms of, whether it's a good idea to have these robots running around. Well, my question is, well, who owns the robots and what are they doing? And whose interests are they serving out?
I think they've been clear doing the menial jobs and the boring jobs, basically, and things that put us at threat. I don't know what they are, but
I guess the challenge,
dangerous jobs.
Yeah, the stuff that I see is the ways in which that these corporations are disrupting entire industries and doing it in a way that's not always necessarily in right relationship. Now, that's to say that obviously there's going to be a technological progression, and this has been happening for decades and thousands of years. You could argue that this sort of displacement is a natural evolution of the human endeavor, but the difference here is to the degree to which that is benefiting a small number of people while harming a disproportionate number of other people. So is it a good idea to sort of replace all workers that are doing a certain, working class job? Well, what happens to all those people that were doing that job, and what does that happen at a systemic level in society? And I think this is where, thinking about what is the future of making sure we create and architect these worlds that really work for everybody. And, what type of ways are there reskilling? Are there new opportunities? But I guess I'm not a supporter of just unbridled technological innovation when it has this sort of asymmetry of disrupting underlying aspects of our society in a way that isn't really thinking about that in a comprehensive way, especially if they're, not necessarily, paying their fair share of taxes, or like there's this split between the haves and have-nots, and how do you make sure that we create a society that, has enough resources and is equitable in certain ways. And I think in a way that we have right now, it's got this huge lopsided way in which that these tech companies end up having these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars for these owners, while people are like living below the poverty line. So there's some underlying things there that I'm more skeptical of, just sort of like unbridled technological innovation without really thinking about the larger pictures of it. And this may be some of the larger pictures as what the government is doing. We talked about the ethical aspects of what the culture is doing, what the laws and the government's doing, what the market dynamics are doing, and what the technological innovation and the architecture is doing itself. So this may be an area where, how do we sort of address some of these fundamental inequalities, not only within a country, but also around the world. And I don't foresee a world where like having robots replace all these different workers, if that's necessarily going to be technological progress, if it's, creating a situation that makes it so much harder for so many other people. So I don't know. I feel like it is a technological inevitability that we're on that path, but the ethical question becomes, okay, what are the side effects? What are the harms of doing that? And I think it's not without harms. And so to just sort of focus on technological innovation without the harms, yeah.
Does not the ethical question there just come down to keep people alive and entertained? Is it as simple as that?
Well, I mean, we're talking about like how to construct more of a utopian society where everybody's needs are met and they're taken care of, and they're able to kind of like, just kind of have a lot of leisure time and entertained. And this is, I think
Well, entertainment, I don't just mean by leisure time. I mean, meaningful, purposeful, rewarding, respected, all of those things that come under, a healthy human being, I suppose.
Well, it makes me think of something like Ready Player One, which is set in like this sort of future world. I think it's like 2045 or something. It might be 20, yeah, I think 2045. But it's a world that's kind of unraveled because we haven't been taking care of the world in a certain way, and people are kind of the opium of the masses, being
Okay.
able to kind of escape into VR worlds while they're living
Yeah.
in complete dissolution. I mean, that I don't think, like, if we do nothing, that's sort of like the roadmap of where we're on. And is that a good future? Then I'm going to say no. I don't think necessarily that's a good out. Like the vision of having that world of Ready Player One, I don't think is the world that we actually want to sort of just sleepwalk into because we don't do something different. So yeah, I mean, I think
think
science
that's the main point of the film, isn't it? Is the rebellious nature of trying to escape the need to be in there all the time. And yeah, no, it's a really interesting. That we are so over time, Kent, but this is a fascinating subject, and I'm obviously really, really enjoying talking to you because there's so many things I've got on my personal list that we haven't even touched, and we haven't got time to do. I
Yeah,
wanted to
well,
talk about
I'm happy to stay as long as you want to
health,
chat.
health. So no, we'll have a 3-hour one. Health and psychology in VR, art in VR, because immersive content is an enormous amount of stuff you've been doing. You've gone to all the Tribecas and things, and seen an awful lot of really immersive, awesome things in art. We haven't talked about immersive education. Touched on gaming, which is obviously a passion of mine, and just generally talking about social interactions, good or bad, in VR. But I think we'll have to have a second podcast at some point in the not too
Yeah, happy
distant
to
future.
come back and talk
I'll
about it
do
and
that
hear all
again.
those things.
I do want to talk about a few things. First of all, I really would just want to ask you the direct question. Do you think we're in a simulation?
I do not, no. And the reason why I don't, well, I can't prove whether or not we're in a simulation or not. There's nothing I could sort of test to know for sure. But I suspect that, this gets into what is the underlying metaphysical nature of reality. And I suspect that it's much more of something like these emergent dynamic processes that are unfolding, like Alfred North Whitehead's metaphysical framework is something that I look to. That is that metaphysical framework doesn't preclude that we would be in a simulation within that metaphysical framework. We could be, but I suspect that we're not. That reality is something that hasn't been. I don't think we're in an engineered reality that has been created by higher beings. I think that that there's a lot of nice sort of ideas from Platonism, and I like the Platonic. I'm a fan of Plato, and I like the sort of ideas of there's like this a Platonic realm of ideal forms, and I like the idea of how the simulation sort of alludes to that there's an underlying sort of code of reality. I do think there are what Whitehead calls eternal objects, or from math perspective, that there would be these objects in an eternal realm that could be non-spatial temporal. This gets into the philosophy of math of like to what degree are there math objects that are interfacing with reality. Aristotle talked about different types of causation. One of the forms of causation is the formal causation, meaning that there's a blueprint of reality that may be interfacing with reality. So I like ideas of like Plato and Aristotle's formal causation, and the idea that math objects are actually real in a Platonic realm of ideal forms, and they're subtly interfacing with the nature of reality. But aside from that,
So
it's
fundamentally, the butterfly effect of everything we do, say, is all in organically unfolding in front of us because of its effects.
yeah, or that there's sort of a maybe a baseline reality that we don't fully understand yet, and that just because
You
we don't
think,
understand it doesn't mean that we're in
but
a
it's
kind of a simulation.
so extending that out. Are we going to create a simulation? Is that also something? Do you believe that will happen?
I think we will certainly. I mean, that's the trajectory of the metaverse, and we will be creating other simulations. And there's a whole section on simulation theory I have in my 1000th episode, where Hassan Karuni says that if we're not already in a simulation, we will create this simulation, and there will be entities within that simulation that are asking themselves whether or not they live in a simulation. So I do think
Wow,
that I do think that's
proper
probably
inception happening right there.
Yeah.
I'm going to quote some people now and then ask a really important set of questions. The Pytheria, Nostradamus, Daniel Douglas Home, Edgar Cayce, Gene Dixon, and Baba Vanga. Do you know what all those guys did?
No, I haven't heard of them.
They predicted things in the future and they came true. Most people have heard of Nostradamus. I must admit I hadn't heard of Baba Vanga. If we'd have sat down and had a really good conversation the first time I met you, probably 6 years ago, and we'd have predicted where VR may have been in the future in 5 years' time, it would have been a really interesting show to listen back to today. So rather than skip that opportunity again, what do you think VR and AR is going to look like? And in 5 years' time, who do you think will be hardware-wise? What software do you think will come out? All the 1,600 conversations you've had, do your best at distilling what things are going to look like in 5 years' time for us.
Yeah, I think in 2025 we'll probably hitting like an inflection point of immersive technologies where they'll certainly be at a critical mass, I think. It also depends a lot on what's happening with the pandemic. I mean, even within the course of 2020, there's things that I saw the trajectory of where virtual worlds were going, and I think that the pandemic only like accelerated a lot of those in a lot of ways. Even though the VR immediately didn't sort of take off and go viral, let's say at a massive level, I think there's been sort of a doubling effect that's happening. And so this year over year, there's been a doubling of VR. So I think that, I think it's reasonable to expect that there'll be a continual doubling year over year of VR, maybe even faster than a doubling. Hopefully there'll be more competition from just Facebook. We'll have Apple. We'll have maybe even like an open source version of the hardware that's out there. That folks put together, that they're able to kind of get beyond what the corporate, that's more of a stretch goal, more of a optimistic goal.
Do you think we're on a literal Moore's law with VR then?
Well, Moore's law in terms of the technology diffusion out into the culture. Yeah, I think it is like it's on this path of diffusing out into the culture, and I expect that there's enough compelling things that I've seen, but it really requires like a diversity of different creators and content because, frankly, a lot of where the VR industry is now is for a very small subset of gamers. A lot of the stuff that I see at the film festivals doesn't necessarily get broader distribution because it's just not supported at an institutional level, and there hasn't been good distribution channels to be able to get the diversity of content that we would really need to get to really have it, kind of at this mass ubiquitous level. You could look. There's a theorist named Simon Wardley that I really look to, where he spells out these 4 phases of technology. First is the duct tape prototype, where it's like you're proving out the idea, like in academia. Then you have the enterprise custom bespoke applications, and then you have after those custom bespoke applications, you have the consumer launch of the technologies where it's more in the hands of people at large. And the last phase is the mass ubiquity, where it's just like everywhere, right? Now you could say, well, are cell phones ubiquitous? Are smartphones ubiquitous? I'd say like maybe cell phones are pretty ubiquitous, not like universal that everybody in the world has one, but there are still some differences between, say, iOS versus Android, So in some ways, even cell phones haven't got into that, mass ubiquity level, which would be functionally like buying a CPU or GPU, where you just like are looking at how good it is, or you're looking at like gasoline or electricity, where it's like there's no functional difference between it. Like it's a commodity to the point where it's just everywhere. So I think we're maybe on the long scale of things, we're on this path towards ubiquity. I'd say maybe by 2045, maybe these immersive technologies will be massively ubiquitous. And I think there'll be enough of a consumer market by 2025, the next 5 years, that it'll really sustain a larger ecosystem. And so we're going to have like gaming is going to be on the forefront. There's going to be medical applications, remote work and data visualization type of applications. And the types of things that I'll expect to see more and more over the next 5 years are ways of people representing themselves with digital avatars and virtual representations of themselves, of VTubers, ways of digital economy and the ways in which the cryptocurrency is starting to meld into the underlying economic ecosystems for people to start to support and sustain themselves. I'd love to see more aspects of self-sovereign identity for people to be able to kind of control their identity and go in between different virtual metaverse spaces and be able to take different aspects of their avatar representation and their maybe different virtual goods that they want to take between different virtual worlds. I'd hope to see that, but I expect for the first phase of being a closed wall garden, and then eventually we're going to start to have more of an openness there, kind of following Metcalfe's law, meaning that the value of the network is worth the number of the nodes in the network squared. So the more, like, there was CompuServe and AOL, and there's the HTML, right? So eventually HTML had hypertext links between the different worlds, and those hypertext links were able to create a network that was more valuable than what was at AOL or CompuServe. So I think we're in this sort of AOL CompuServe phase of the metaverse, where there's going to be things like VR Chat or Rec Room or Facebook Horizon, where there's going to be a lot of self-contained aspects of the metaverse. But eventually I expect to see it open up into like the open web, where it's going to be easier to kind of go in between these different worlds.
See an avatar node on OpenXR at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, so being able to kind of have interoperability with I think that'll start to happen a lot more in 5 years from now. It's already starting to be built with the prototypes and the specs, but just to kind of like, the ultimate potential episode, I go through all the different ultimate potentials, and there's like education and telepresence and being able to sort of data visualization. There's being able to have virtual homes, your own worlds that you're building and owning, and ways that you're connecting to your home and family. There's entertainment and gaming. Obviously pornography is a part that will continue to grow and expand in different ways, but there's also medical applications and ways that you're dealing with and hanging out with your romantic partners. There's ways that we deal with in death and grieving, and in what degrees are we kind of looking to see the ephemeral nature of things kind of coming and dying, and having temporary experiences, and the lack of backwards compatibility. Just like the internet, there's websites that go offline. There's a number of VR experiences that we can experience today that we won't be able to experience in 5 years because maybe we don't. I hope that we're able to preserve and archive all these experiences, but it's not doing a good job of being stewards of this digital culture and heritage. And so a lot of these experiences are ephemeral in the sense that they'll be dead, and we won't be able to actually have a lot of the same experiences that we can have right now in 5 years, unfortunately. Maybe OpenXR will help that, but we haven't been preserving and being good stewards of all of our immersive experiences. It's going to change higher education and our training, and change ways that we're sort of engaging with our way that we work, the way that we hang out with our friends and families, and be able to appreciate the diversity. And I'd say, like, being able to have more accessible VR, so people that are not fully able-bodied being able to have more access to a lot of these immersive experiences. So that's sort of a quick run through of all the ultimate potentials and the different aspects to think about. And for me, I think at the core, these technologies are allowing us to learn more about ourselves, to learn more about each other, to learn more about how to be in relationship to the earth, and to understand and experience all dimensions of human experience and reality. So that's sort of the potential now. Whether or not to what degree that we'll do that, and we'll have to sort of address some of the different ethical issues about privacy. That's certainly a big challenge. We'll have a U.S. federal privacy law. I don't know. I hope. Or maybe there'll be underlying sort of human rights that we start to translate and see. Facebook has already started to do this with their responsible innovation dimensions. They've sort of inspired by human rights. So continuing to look at some of these different ethical trade-offs and figure out how to have a diversity of these different approaches. So yeah, I mean, that's, maybe it'll be worth me sitting down and making some more concrete predictions, but I think generally those are the different areas that I see where we're headed in the future. And yeah, I hope to see at least, I don't know, let's say 10 different major. Right now we have a duopoly within the cell phone market. We have iOS or Android functionally, and then there's some emerging third open source versions. So I'd love to see that those third versions break the duopoly of the cell phones, just like we have something that right now is maybe going to be like a Facebook versus Apple. If we're still at a Facebook versus Apple in 2025, I'd say that's like a failure, like that we haven't been able to have other options, because, if the future computing platform is only run by two companies, then I don't know. necessarily see that as a win state. I want to see a lot more. I want to see a Valve. I want to see open, hardware initiatives. I want to see a viable Pico VR or Microsoft, headsets, and maybe Google even have something. So for those major companies, and maybe even Snap with some headsets. And maybe some dark horses that are out there that we're not even thinking about as much. Valve, if they continue to kind of push forward and innovate and then be a viable hardware player by 2025, that would be a great outcome. So I want to see a diversity of all these different market. I think it's just better for the market, and also it's going to be better to have many different options and variations for what kind of things that people decide to focus on as they're building these technologies.
Yeah, that's quite a list. Clearly, you are very smart. You retain information incredibly well to be able to even say that off the top of your head. I'm always very impressed by your knowledge, Kent, and you're doing an absolutely amazing job of capturing that knowledge and letting other people listen, really. So, enormous congratulations on 1,000 shows, and I really hope there's 1,000 more, because you are a star within the VR, and it would be incredible to be able to sit back in 5 years' time and have this conversation again and see where we got to. Is there a Dr. or Professor Kent by on the horizon?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like I am want to be sort of a public intellectual in the sense of to do this type of work, but to be supported by the people. So if you do enjoy this, and I recommend people support me on Patreon, patreon.com, Voices of VR, so that I can continue to do this type of work. And yeah, I've already got the next 600 episodes, recorded, and hope to continue to record stuff and put stuff out, because yeah, there's just a lot of aspects of this history that I just am fascinated to kind of trace how these things evolve. And yeah, like you, as we start to think about where things are at and where things are going to go, I think I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And yeah, being able to in part have these conversations like people like yourself and other people in the community to be able to kind of map things out and make our own statements about where we think things are at and where we think they're going.
Well, that is absolutely epic. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We went over by 43 minutes, so that shows you how important these conversations are. I'm really, really interested in the whole ethics side of things as well. We are definitely going to have another conversation at some point in the future, but for now, let's wrap things up. How can people best find you, Kent?
Well, I'm on Twitter at KentBuy, but I'm also at voicesofvr.com. You can track me there, and I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/voicesofvr. And yeah, drop me a note on Twitter, or yeah, you can track the latest episodes. Hopefully, I'll be able to get the episode out tomorrow, on Saturday, and be able to listen for yourself and just kind of listen to this digest. And I think of the Blake Harris did a whole history of the future, which I think was his take of a lot of the major players that were happening in at Oculus as this story was unfolding. And I think a lot of what I've been focusing on is what is that same type of story that's been unfolding, but from the community perspective. So really listening to the different people that are at the frontiers of the community, of the VR community, and what they have to say. So yeah, just if you want to hear some of those voices, then check into that episode 1000 and into the Voices of VR podcast.
Awesome, and please do that. You will not be disappointed. And you can follow me on Twitter at Hibbins. And thank you for Anthony for doing the recording tonight. Much appreciated, Anthony. And you can find us on Roomkey, YouTube, and your favorite podcast provider. Subscribe and like to keep us on your radar. And if you want to host your own show, head over to roomkey.co. It's free and easy to use, and you can automatically export your streams. And you can also find other shows just like this to enjoy. Thank you for joining us on the Metaverse show. Thank you to Kent, and have a great week, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.